Okay, we'll just get started. Well, on behalf of our university president, Arizona State University's Dr. Michael Crow, I want to welcome everybody to our DC campus, known as the Barrett O'Connor Center, one of the few buildings in Washington, DC named after women. And you know that Justice O'Connor was the first woman on the Supreme Court, and Barbara Barrett most recently was the Secretary of the United States Air Force and creator of Space Force. And so we're glad to have you here in the Washington campus of Arizona State University. This is a continuing series on creating a strategy for 21st century deterrence. And it's brought to you by the Arizona State University Laboratory for Leadership, Diplomacy, and National Security. And the co-founders, Ambassador Michael Polt, Ambassador Edward O'Donnell, and myself are here with the one who really runs the lab, Ashley Wright, in the back, and who makes everything happen. And we'd like to thank she and Derek, who's making all the technology work. How about a round of applause for those folks and helping us make this happen tonight? My name is Ben Franklin. I'm a retired Army Lieutenant General. My role in the lab is to work on the leadership side and the national security side, which I share with another lab member, Ambassador David Sheffer, who will be a part of the panel tonight as and is doing the work on 21st century deterrence. The previous two sessions focused on deterrence and the use of corporate law to shape foreign policy. And the second was on using lawfare, or the use of law to shape foreign policy, and actually indicting those who create conflict and break the rule of international law. Tonight, we're so excited to have Lieutenant General Schmidl with us, who I've known a few years, since 2000, I think, so a few years. Lieutenant General Schmidl is a Marine. You'll have to excuse him for that. He had an error in judgment as a young man and always wanted to be in the Army, but had a distinguished Marine Corps career. But he's the ASU University Advisor on cyber capabilities at the Conflict Studies at Arizona State University. He holds a PhD, and he's a professor of practice in the School of Politics and Global Studies, where he researches and studies all aspects of the influence of cyber capabilities on national security strategy, and he teaches a graduate class in that area of study. He's a senior fellow in the Future Security Initiative at Arizona State University, exploring the effects of technology on human conflict. While on active duty, he served as the first Deputy Commanding General of United States Army Cyber Command. He was responsible for standing up the command while concurrently executing full spectrum cyber operations. Subsequently, he was the Commanding General of Marine Aviation, and his final assignment on active duty was the Principal Deputy Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, which means he and his team were evaluating every system that the military would bring in as an advisor to our Secretary of Defense directly on what to resource and what not to resource, but that cost assessment and program evaluation in the Office of Secretary of Defense. He's a member of the National Security Agency Advisory Board, a member of the Council of Foreign Relations, and the Defense Science Board. Please join me in welcoming my good friend, Rooster Schmidl.
Thanks, Ben. Oh my gosh, thanks for the introduction. How's the volume working? We good? All right, here we go. Okay, so what we're gonna talk about for the next few minutes is deterrence, specifically with regard to cyber deterrence is what we're gonna focus on. What I'd like to do, though, is to start at the beginning. So as a little bit more background, my doctoral dissertation was on the power of context in shaping moral choices. And it focused on the philosophy of Ludwig Wittgenstein. And so that's kind of where my head is on a lot of these things, is trying to go back to the beginning and establish what the problem is that we're trying to solve or to address. What I would suggest that we think about to begin with is that deterrence is not a strategic or a technical concept. It's actually applied psychology. And one of the things that we don't do so well in the Department of Defense or in the government writ large is fully understand that. We are trying to focus on an adversary, on a person, not necessarily on a country. So one of the frustrating things for me when I was in Cape, what Ben mentioned a minute ago, we were trying to figure out how I was involved with Kathleen Hicks, the current DepSecDef. She and I were thrown together to write the national security strategy in 2014-15 timeframe. And one of the things we were trying to do is articulate what a strategy against Russia would look like. And what I was trying to get across to folks in the Pentagon is the strategy isn't against Russia. The strategy ought to be focused on Putin. That, in a totalitarian government, that's who makes those decisions, and that's the person whose head we're really trying to get into and trying to affect. In order to have an effective deterrence, the first thing that we need to do is to understand the adversary's incentive structure. We sometimes begin to talk about things as if they were a deterrent in and of themselves. As an example, you will find people saying that we ought to buy more F-35s because the F-35 is a great deterrent. Well, I don't know. You'd have to ask the Chinese that, and the Houthi rebels certainly don't think it is. So there's things don't deter people. People kind of deter people, and we don't deter through the things that we say. We deter through the things that we do, and governments constantly have that challenge because governments have to write things and say things, and if they don't follow through with actions, then the deterrence that they're trying to accomplish becomes mute. One of the phrases you'll hear in the Department of Defense frequently is, we want to impose cost on an adversary. And I always enjoyed taking people to task for saying that, because I'd say, so what are you talking about? Impose what cost on who? How do you know that bothers them? I'll go back to the Houthi rebels again, right? So these guys and gals, knuckleheads, are shooting missiles that cost $50,000, and we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars to shoot every one of them down. It's kind of like, you're at a picnic and the bees are buzzing around and you keep swatting the bees away, and across the field, there's a big beehive in a tree. Well, sooner or later, even the Marines are going to figure out that beehive has got to go, or we're going to keep swatting the bees away. But so it's not a faceless enemy. We're not imposing costs on somebody to do something. One of the things that I learned when I was in the War College, in the Marine Corps War College, we had an interesting character come in one day to talk to us about strategy and things. And he'd been in the Special Forces unit in Vietnam, and he'd since kind of gone native, and he had hair down the middle of his back, and he was kind of a cool guy. He had it all pulled back in a ponytail, and it was nice and gray. And he gave us one day, not unlike your hair, but his was more gray. But he talked about deterrence and about coercion. And he had been very involved in a lot of the programs that they'd been trying to implement to deter, if you will, the Viet Cong and the Vietnamese and North Vietnamese. And he said, what I remember from the class is he said, look, the capable capacity to coerce is what deterrence is all about. But that capable capacity is not in our eyes. It's in the eyes of the people we're trying to coerce. So if we don't understand what the world looks like from their viewpoint, then it all becomes difficult. We, the US, kind of got away with a lot of this when we had the Russians as an adversary, because we could almost mirror image the Russians and kind of sort of get away with it. The Chinese are very, very different. I just finished a 2-year project on Chinese cognitive warfare and how they view strategy, how they view warfare, and it's just very, very different from the way that we look at it. So if you're trying to shape an adversary's behavior, right? So if you say that deterrence is ultimately about getting someone to do something that I want them to do, there's 2 ways to look at that. You can compel them, which means that they will come to the conclusion that you want them to come to all on their own. Or you can coerce them at the point of a gun or something else to do what you want to do. And it sounds like a nuanced distinction, but it's really important. And I'll give you an example. Today, the Chinese are executing a strategy that we refer to as a fait accompli strategy. So what they'll do is they'll occupy some rock in the South China Sea. They'll put soldiers on it. They'll build an airfield. And they're betting, and so far they've been right, that we, the US, will not take the level of risk necessary to push them off that rock. So they have actually compelled us to do what they want us to do without having to coerce us and have a direct military confrontation. The other issue that comes up is this notion of a declaratory policy in the world of deterrence. So there's been a number of strategy documents that have come out in the last couple of years that talk about our deterrence strategy, right? So starting in 2021 with the national security strategy and I think that's what's getting it. We began to talk about this notion of integrated deterrence, right? Great, nobody would argue with it. But the notion of having an integrated deterrence is only really valuable if you understand who it is you're trying to deter and what behavior you want them to exhibit in the course of your integrated deterrence execution. So we tend to look at in the world of cyber now, so we focus into cyber. We, the US, tend to think about our behavior in the cyberspace as one in which we are leading by example, that we want the world to see that we will accept norms, we will abide by international rules, regulations, but our adversaries don't see it that way. So, for example, the response to the Sony picture shows hack, right? So the North Koreans got into Sony's and Sony Pictures, and if you recall, like 10 years ago, and literally held them at risk. And so shortly after that happened, Secretary Carter started having these Saturday morning, he called them Cyber Saturday sessions, to talk about what we could do against the North Koreans. So we all got together this first Saturday, and we're sitting around, there's about 15 of us around the table, and everybody is talking about how they can't understand how this would happen, et cetera, et cetera. And so I sort of opined that, well, wait a minute. When did we, the US, declare that our motion picture industry was part of our critical infrastructure? Until then, it wasn't. It became part of it shortly afterwards because there was a lot of money involved. But initially, it was not. Nobody thought that the motion picture industry was part of our critical infrastructure. So what happened to the North Koreans that did that? Nothing. And so if you're going to try to deter in the world of cyber as a broader deterrence strategy, then you have to be prepared to take action against people that don't abide by that. Now, there's a couple of other pieces that are at work here. With that particular evolution, they were actually going into the Sony infrastructure through servers that were in China. So one wonders to what extent the Chinese were witting or not of that, however, so that nothing is as easy as it ever appears. 2021, I mentioned, we came out with a new national security strategy. And in that strategy, they talked about the DoD strategy for cyber deterrence was what was known as persistent engagement, is the term they used, right? And so that was in 2021. 20 years before that, I was working for a very young Army Brigadier General named Ben Frakely, and I was an older U.S. Marine Corps colonel, and we were in the Joint Staff J8, and the J8 does resourcing, and at the time we were doing some conceptual things, looking down the road, trying to understand how to deal with the adversary. This was shortly after 9/11, but with the adversaries, plural, that we saw in front of us. And we came up with this concept known as persistent engagement. And what it was all about was trying to engage the enemy and continue to engage the enemy without ever letting go. Because the kind of the US way of war is that we tend to pulse power at things. We pulse military power, we pulse things, and then we stop. And we give the enemy an opportunity to regroup and rethink, and then we go back at them again. I mean, we do it tactically with off of aircraft carriers with alpha strikes, right? We all launch off, we all get circled up together. Everybody takes a deep breath, tightens up their lap belts, and in we go to wherever we're going. And we get the living, you know what, shot out of us for a while, and we all come back. But the adversary then has time to regroup and do things again. So now what happened in 2021 is in the cyber world, US Cyber Command wrote this strategy that said, no, we're going to be engaged all the time with the adversary as a way of defending our own networks. The following year, in 2022, Paul Nakasone, the director of NSA and the commander of Cyber Command, takes it a step further and says, no, our strategy is actually to be engaged forward, to be defending forward, he called it. And the way he described that is to be defending our networks in cyberspace, deterring the adversary by being inside of their space, in foreign space. So if you think about the shift that we've made from hunkering down behind our networks and holding down and trying to keep the adversary from coming at us, or actually going into the adversary space and trying to stop them before they start. Both are forms of deterrence. The latter, I would suggest, is probably a lot more effective. About this same time is when this notion of integrated deterrence came up. And nobody can argue with it, except in execution. Because a deterrent strategy that's focused on nothing except bringing, quote, deterrent capabilities together just doesn't work. The example that I can give you to best understand this is, remember a couple of years back, the Somali pirates, right? The pirates in Somalia, they were sorting out, they were manning, they were taking over ships, and we had destroyers out there. Even the Chinese provided a cruiser at one point out there in about the 2008-9 timeframe. And it was a big show of force. It didn't stop at all. What eventually stopped the Somali pirates is when Lloyd's of London refused to insure ships that were sailing in that area unless they had security details on board each of the ships. Okay, so the shipping companies went out and hired security folks, and most of them were like the bar in Star Wars, right? They were mercenaries that were not disciplined. They put them on these ships, and every time a Somali ship of pirates or whoever it was came anywhere near them, these guys opened fire and started killing them. Well, within 2 weeks, all of a sudden, there were no more boardings. There were no more piracy. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's necessarily, the way that one ought to execute a national security strategy. What I'm saying is, though, that the fact that proved to be the biggest deterrence, and if we think about it, it was started by an insurance company. So there was an economic piece of this thing that nobody had really factored into it. And then when you had all these undisciplined mercenaries that were shooting at anybody that came close to them, all of a sudden the Somali pirates weren't quite so enthusiastic about boarding ships. Okay, at the end, just to kind of wrap my remarks up here, we think about deterrence in cyberspace, we think about a couple of things. The resiliency of our own networks, the people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones kind of thing. The extent to which you do that, and as I explained a second ago, Cyber Command is now taking the view that the best way to do that is not to hide behind a barricade, but to go out and find the enemy and do something about it out there. Attribution. Attribution has traditionally been a very difficult thing for us to do in the cyber world. Generally speaking, once something hops through the third server, it becomes very difficult to trace it all the way back to find out. But the other thing to think about is, even if you could, what are you going to do about it? So if you could trace a cyber attack back, for instance, to a GRU unit, a Russian intelligence unit, what are you going to do about it? Because if we are a country of norms, just going in and frying that server is probably not something we might be inclined to do, but maybe. Allies and partners, this is hugely, is a huge part of what we do. It's not just the Five Eyes, which are the countries that are closest to us intelligence-wise. It's really everybody that we have relations with. And the last thing that I would mention to you is that it's not technology that you need in the cyber world to deter. It's actually authorities and policies that have a greater impact. The technology it's kind of like every other arms race. We've got really bright people, so do some other folks. And every time you produce something, somebody will figure out a way to top it or a way to get around it or beyond it. But it's the authorities that you give to the folks that are in charge of the deterrence and the policies that they have to undertake that really kind of make a difference. We think all the way back to the nuclear deterrence back in the 50s, so much of that was so different because we had seen what an atomic weapon could do. However, if you think about the North Vietnamese or the Iraqi or the Al-Qaeda, rather, or the ISIS, none of those folks were at all deterred by our atomic weapons because, in my opinion, they didn't believe we'd ever use them against them. So it goes back to this. This is a game of psychology more than anything else. It's understanding the enemy's incentive structure and then crafting a way to deter them or to get them either to compel them or coerce them to do what it is that you want to do. And the last thing I'll tell you is that I think if you think about deterrence not by cyber, but through cyber, in other words, the whole domain of cyber becomes a transport through which you can move things to affect a deterrent strategy, as opposed to saying, I've got all these cyber capabilities, therefore I'm going to deter you, because we will no sooner make our networks harder and some smart person will figure out another way to get in there. And at the end of the day, so. Yep.
Questions for General Smittle, you can submit them and we'll ask them later in the discussion, but over to Ambassador Shepard for some questions.
Thanks so much, General. That was fascinating. In fact, at the end there, I had visions in my mind of a movie script of cyber warriors touring with the psychology of their counterparts, you know, in the other country.
That would be good.
Through your strategy. Can I ask just a basic question, which is that of all of the military capabilities we have for deterrence, how would you rank cyber defense within that category of priorities for our military?
That's a great question. So I'll answer it first by stating that if you think about the way that we would envision, we the United States, trying to deal with a military operation against a pure competitor, so Chinese or the Russians, all of our concepts are all reliant on having secure, reliable communications. So that part of the cyber world, we just rely on that without even thinking about it. In the same way that we rely on space capabilities, that without really even spending much time on it. The extent to which our networks are resilient does, I think, have a very big part to play in an overall deterrence strategy. Now, operationally, our networks are, let's say they're good. The challenge becomes when you start to connect with partners and allies, right? So potentially, especially if you look in the Pacific region, there are other countries over there that we very much want to have closer relationships with, but their level of cybersecurity might not be such that we would be comfortable doing that. We learned a lesson in Afghanistan. We set up this thing called the Afghan Mission Network, which was a network that was going to be in Afghanistan to be used by the Allies. And at the time they set this up, this is 2006 or 7, the National Security Agency and a lot of other people had some real concerns about the security. But at the 4-star level, it ran through the tank and they said, nope, operationally, we need to do this. This is absolutely imperative to our success in Afghanistan. So even understanding the vulnerabilities of the network, it was put in place. Here's what happened. The network at certain places touched the US SIPRNet. So the SIPRNet is our secret network, and it's what we do all of our warfighting on, we, the US military. Well, what happened is that the Russians, God love them, they went and bought tens of hundreds of thumb drives, and they infected the thumb drives, and they just put them into the supply system in Afghanistan. Secretary Gates is on a trip over there, and one of the staff that's there is trying to find a place to run off copies of this brief that they're going to show him, right? Well, they know that the brief is unclassified. So this young soldier, sailor, airman, marine, I don't know who it was, took the thumb drive and said smartly, well, I can't plug this in. I couldn't put a classified thumb drive in an unclassified network, but surely I could put an unclassified thumb drive in a classified network. So he does, boom. And what happens is it gets into the network and it launches this piece of malware. But nobody knows about it, right? And they're having a big time and they're printing his copies and Secretary Gates has a great visit. And about 2 or 3 days later, some people that work in the United States government begin to see this thing. Not that, it's in another. And everybody goes, how could that possibly happen? So that caused us to shut the network. It caused a whole lot of things, but that was an example of a vulnerability in our SIPRNet that nobody ever saw coming. So when you think about China and this national strategy to deal with China, it's got a lot to do with partners and allies and bringing them closer and sharing information. And so there becomes a vulnerability that's beyond just our networks. So.
And if the cyber capability fails, through such an example as you've just given, it actually has incredible reverberation among other elements of military deterrence, because so much relies upon the cyber connections.
Absolutely. When I was at the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab in the late 90s, we conducted a series of experiments. And one of the things that we did is we had a command center that we were, believe it or not, fighting a war in Oakland, California. And we brought in some red teamers to start to try to affect this. This was a wireless internet. This was like, goddamn bleeding edge technology in 1999. But one of the things that I noticed in my staff, and there was probably about 50 of them in a room like this, is that when the images that they were looking at on the screen, when they began to doubt the veracity of those images, it just slowed. It didn't slow, it stopped everything. The command actually operated better off of paper and telephones than they did when they were staring at these images going, can that be real? That icon, why is it moving like that? So the ability to create that kind of confusion in a command system would have an extraordinary ripple effect throughout the entire operation.
Well, as we look at the evolution of U.S. capability, military capability, we used to be organized with the Navy, with the Marines inside of it, and the Army and the Army Air Corps. And we thought that the air was such an important domain after the Second World War that we created the Air Force. And we've looked at the Air Force and space growing as a domain. We thought it was so important that we should organize a space force. Are we organized to deter with the way we are currently structured? Should there be a cyber service versus the militaries having cyber branches? What are your thoughts about, are we organized?
Yeah.
Because in your remarks, you said that part of deterrence is having that capability to deter.
Yeah.
Do we have that capability?
So that's a great question. First of all, when you create a service, you create a tremendous amount of baggage, right, that goes along with it. I mean, look, every general's got to have an aide, got to have a car, you got to have staff. I mean, it just gets out of control. When we created the United States Cyber Command, we made a clear-eyed commitment to stand it up as a sub-unified command, which meant that a lot of what we would need to do, I used Stratcom, that was our unified command, to do that. Well, what that did is it freed up me to begin to run operations within weeks of standing up the command, because I didn't, all the admin creep, I just had nothing to do with. The challenge with that is more about personalities than anything else. But anyway, so that's part of it. The service thing, I don't know. This project that I just finished on cognitive warfare was actually entitled Organizing for 21st Century Warfare. And it was a grant that we'd been given. And one of the suggestions we made about organizing for that was that we might need to look at an organization that had space, cybercom, and SOCOM. If you were really going to deal with Chinese cognitive warfare at scale, that's the kind of an organization you needed to pull together. I guess if you knew how to stand up a service without spending a year trying to figure out which uniform you're going to wear, and you know, I mean, it just happens. It's just human nature. It's the way we do things. And so, I don't know, but I know that I have actually talked to some members on the Hill last week when I was doing something else over there, and I was asked that same question because there is some interest in whether or not we can sustain the pool of recruits is the problem right now. So as an example, in the Marine Corps, most of the Marines that come into the cyber world generally come in on a 6-year commitment, right? Most of the Marines come in on a 4-year commitment, but if they're going to that technical thing, they get there. So by the time they get through boot camp, they go through ITS, they go through all that training, and then they go and do their cyber training and their OJT stuff, and they're actually a qualified on-net operator. They're like at year 4.5 or 5, and now they got a year left to go. And the Marine Corps is telling them, hey, if you stay in, we got a deal for you. You're going to recruiting duty in Sheboygan. And the guy goes, what? What am I doing that for? So it's a challenge. So how you keep those people becomes an issue, not only with that, but because Google is camped out outside the gates at Fort Meade, and every goddamn young the service member that comes out there handing them a card and saying, hey, come talk to me when you get ready to leave, because I'll pay you 3 times what they are. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how Space Force eventually evolves. And quite frankly, right now they're having a big discussion about Space Command. Well, if I look at this logically, I don't know why there is a Space Command. I mean, I don't know why does that place even exist? Why is it not part of Space Force? Who knows?
So just to clarify, General Swindle, 2 things. One, does each service branch, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, even Coast Guard, do they all have sub commands on cyber
They do.
that you then coordinate out of the Pentagon?
They do.
And that's why you were explaining to us, frankly, you could get the job done more efficiently by having it set up that way than by having a separate cyber command.
Yeah.
That, you know, is its own.
No, that's a great observation. So when we first created Cyber Command, one of the very first things that occurred there in my role as a deputy that I was able to get done is created the National Mission Force. And I did that with the thought that we were going to create a JSOC-like entity for cyber. And part of the reason that was really pushing me to do that is at the time we were dealing with PACOM on some issues with Chinese intrusions into some of the networks, and it became very difficult because the commander of PACOM felt like this was his responsibility, although he didn't have the authorities or the capacity to do that. So immediately we started running into that. My initial guidance or my initial thoughts were that we should husband all of those capabilities at Cyber Command, centralize it in a way that would make it possible for us to do kind of exquisite maneuvers. But that's not what we decided to do. We decided to spread load the world out there. So now each of the commands has their own Cyber Command, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps. And they all do great things, and we've kind of divided places up that they all there's areas of responsibility. But each of the services is having their own separate challenges with recruitment and retention of that cyber force, as is NSA on the civilian side. So.
And that was my second point. Did I understand you to say that a serviceman or woman actually goes through almost 4 years of training before they're actually on deck in their respective cyber command doing cyber work?
In the Marine Corps, in the Air Force and the Army, I don't think it's quite that long because we have a longer pipeline of early entry harassment that we like to put people through. So, but I think that the message though is the same, which is even if they were trained in 3 years or whatever, that there is a point where the services, in order for you to continue to get promoted, you need to go do service specific things, to go to recruiting duty, to go to the drill field, to do whatever. One of the and in order to do that, you're going to take these people out of something that you out of a specialized category. I tried to get this notion of the way we deal with aviators in the Marine Corps. right? So we stay in an airplane for a while, probably the first 8, 9 years of our life. And then you start going to staff tours and doing other things. But we try to, and when we stood up a new airplane, like the V-22, I actually had something to do with that. At the time, I was running aviation in the hallway, and I just made it possible for us to keep people in that airplane flying and working on it for like 12 or 15 years without it hurting their careers. But it took that level of personal involvement to make that happen. So one of the things, to Ben's point about if you create a service, you now can create your own inside of that service, your own policies for promotion and advancement. We had when I first got in Cyber Command, we had a GS-15 who was an Air Force type who was just awesome. And he was trying to get to be an SES, but all the SES billets were owned by the US Air Force. Don't ask me why, but that's the way it worked out. And the Air Force said to him, well, yeah, we'll consider you, but you got to come back to headquarters Air Force and do a tour here, working in the planning. He says, but I'm a cyber guy. I've been doing this stuff for, for years. And again, it got all the way to the service chief level to make an exception for this one guy. And everybody was clapping. And I said, we shouldn't celebrate this. It shouldn't take that level of leadership to make this happen. We should institutionalize it.
Ben, I've got another question for the general. You talked about forward engagement in the cyber context.
Mhm.
Can you give us an example of how the cyber command tests its capabilities? Does it actually test it against an adversary or potential adversary to see what the reaction is? Or does it test it perhaps in coordination with allies, but not literally against the adversary? In other words, it's like having, joint exercises with the South Koreans or testing our missiles. We test all the time, but how do you test in Cyber Command?
Oh, well, there are ranges on which you can test technical capabilities. There are numerous opportunities to test those capabilities in the wild. And it depends on the mission, it depends on what you're doing. One of the challenges that has always been extant since we started is the National Security Agency has authorities to do operate in forward space and do intelligence collection. Initially, U.S. Cyber Command under Title 50, or excuse me, under Title 10, which are U.S. uniform policies for military operations. If you were to do an operation like that under Title 10 authorities, it could be considered a rather aggressive act, okay? But the challenge in cyberspace is that it's so difficult to tell the difference between a probe for an intelligence activity and a probe that could eventually wind up doing something malicious, and that's one of the challenges. But in terms of testing, I think they probably get enough exposure that they're relatively confident in what some of those things will do. It depends on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to enter a particular network, generally you'll do a lot of probing of that network so you understand it. You'll build a very exquisite tool to do some specific thing. Where I think the real kind of future lies in this cyber tools world is in offensive tools against weapon systems. Because a weapon system is designed to be plug and play by its very nature. It's designed so that parts of it can be destroyed and I can take a common piece and stick it in there and make it work. Well, if that's the case, then I ought to be able to take some of my electronic warfare techniques, I ought to be able to wrap them around a tool. I ought to be able to take this tool and drop it into a weapon system through some kind of RF propagation and have it do something nefarious to that weapon system. And I could build them at scale because they're all relatively the same. Networks are not that way. Each one of them is a little bit different and they're patched differently. And it doesn't take much. I mean, literally somebody can run a patch and one night and the next morning you can't get back in again. So,
Ben, shall we go to the audience or would you like to ask another?
Just one more for me. You opened up thankfully that when you created Cyber Command, a principle was going to be we're going to operate by the rules or law.
Yeah.
a lot of our listeners think that U.S. military can do whatever they want to. U.S. military is highly regulated, highly adhere to law.
Mm.
That's a good thing about our military, but having commanded a joint task force in Afghanistan can be pretty limiting. But you also mentioned that it's not about technology, it's policy and authorities.
Mhm.
So what policy and authorities don't we have to be a greater deterrent, have greater deterrent capacity?
Well, I mean, we could talk about that for days, but Cyber Command now does have authorities that are much more flexible than they were even 5 years ago. The
It would have to be ever evolving, wouldn't they?
It does, and sometimes the authorities come out on a case-by-case basis. You know, for example, we, the U.S. government, have had some very active roles in trying to keep the elections secure, right? And in the last couple of cycles, the big challenge was the Russians, and they were trying to disrupt things, and yak. And so we had people doing stuff that would make you proud to be an American to keep that from happening. The Chinese now, in the last couple of years, have transitioned from simply stealing national security secrets to trying to be much more disruptive in social media, and they're kind of following the Russians' lead on that. So I don't know where that goes now, but I think the discussion that you saw about these 702 authorities with General Nakasone, about the authorities that it is absolutely huge, and I think that if some of the people that were critical of that would take the time to understand the technology and exactly what it is that they're looking at, you might find that some of those arguments are not quite as fruitful, shall we say. And so, yeah, I mean, the person that could tell you that best right now would be Tim Haug, who's a commander up there, of what exactly he needs to be able to do. But a lot of it depends on the mission that they've been given. And if his mission is to keep the election from being disruptive, well, you know, there's a million questions you're going to ask right behind that. So what the heck does that mean? I mean, does that mean that the integrity of the system? Does that mean that somebody wants to address disinformation on websites? Are we going to stop some of the algorithms that Facebook has that go to, you know, one of my favorite stories at a conference in Princeton a couple of years ago, one of the folks was telling us Facebook's got an algorithm in the news, Facebook news, 3 times. You hit on a story 3 times and you will never see another story that doesn't comport with your worldview. It'll just not happen. So if that's what you're asking for Facebook for your news, that's all you're going to get. After you do it 3 times and you go, I want to see this, and whether it's on the right or the left or in the middle somewhere, and that's all you're going to see. So hard to say where that line stops when you say we want to ensure the security of our elections.
For example. Okay, how about the audience? We'll take some questions, please. Please.
Yeah, okay. I just was wondering, because you kind of alluded to when we're talking about the future of cyber defense as a deterrent, you sort of alluded to an industry outside of defense, outside of military, outside of intelligence with the insurance companies.
Mhm.
So whether it's a highly educated, highly informed speculation, just
Yeah.
in terms of the ecosystem that's going to shape the future, what are some of those intradisciplinary collaborations that you think are going to be really pivotal
Yeah.
in the future of cyber defense?
So the first thing that does come to mind is the insurance world. And one of the classes that I teach I teach 2 courses at ASU. One is an overview of cybersecurity that kind of comes to soup to nuts of where we're at. And the other course that I teach is on the effects of emerging technologies on the development of strategies, national security strategies. This issue about lawfare, or more importantly, insurance fare, comes up all the time. And on the civilian side, one of my co-faculty members there is in the commercial cybersecurity business, and the insurance companies are now beginning to play a much greater role in that. And they're refusing to insure certain operations unless they meet certain criteria. And if you were to go up to Fort Meade right now and ask any of the seniors up there, what is the biggest single thing you can do to keep your network secure? They'll tell you it's very simple. It's patching the network and it's password control. I mean, it's just blocking and tackling skills. If it takes an insurance company to force that on you, then maybe that's okay. The other thing to think about is years ago, back in the 1920s and 30s, we created the Federal Communications Commission, right? And at the time, the conspiracy theorists said this is the end of the world, it's the end of free speech as we know it. And even though Mussolini and Hitler took advantage of that, we don't want any of that here in the US, but it did, and they do regulate that. So there may come a point where a regulation of, and you see this going back and forth right now, may become an issue. As long though as we have the classic picture from a couple of years ago when they had Zuckerberg and a bunch of others testifying before the Senate, and the picture of the senators and them, I mean, there were two different planets there. They were not even in the same world. They were just speaking Greek to each other. And so we have to have people that are in positions that are making policy choices that have enough technical understanding. And they don't have to be computer scientists. They just have to have enough understanding to be able to bridge that gap. What I told people on active duty and what I tell my students now is the same thing. That to me is the future of the leadership in this thing, are people that have invested enough in the technology, they understand enough of it, yet they understand the bigger picture. And the analogy that I keep going back to is aviation, right? So when I went through flight school, we learned about this Italian guy named Bernoulli, right? And he makes airplanes fly. And you push the stick forward and the trees get bigger, you pull it back and they get smaller. I got it. I'm not an aeronautical engineer, but I understand enough about the way airplanes fly that if somebody came in and told me, hey, I can do this, this, and this, like, oh, you're nuts. Well, we need that in the world of cyber. And we need that level of expertise. And I think that people that can do both of those, the students that I have successfully managed to get into cyber jobs here in the government, one of them was a cyber geek, the other was not. And they just, wanted her broader skills. And so there's tremendous opportunities, but I think that having a multimodal academic career is really, really important to doing that. And I think that's where it's going to come from. Just thinking about things like, well, what if the insurance companies did? What if the regulators did that? I mean, we need that kind of thought, and we won't get it from computer scientists because they're necessarily more narrowly focused.
Sorry, I'm sorry, thank you. General, you used that term, you talked about resilience before. And I attended the conference 10, 12, 15 years ago, where cybersecurity in Estonia, where a cybersecurity expert stood in front of an audience and said, one of the big problems about the use of the internet and about our use of cyberspace is that we're using it for things that it was never intended for. That everything we do now is based on this backbone that is carrying all this responsibility for our entire society's functioning, or even its survival, if you will. And we have no backup systems. And what she was arguing, this expert, was we ought to have some copper lines left, some various things to go ahead and give us. When you talk about resilience, it shouldn't just be protecting our cyberspace, but also having what's plan B? What is the thing that we will use when Putin explodes a nuclear weapon in space and takes everything down? Then what are we going to do? Is there any thinking going on? It actually relates to your question about also public-private partnerships. In other words, it's not just working but it's not just our military or not just our government, but most of the knowledge actually exists in the private sector. So what is there that the backbone goes beyond that?
A great question. So the infrastructure, most all of it is owned by the private sector, not by the government, number one. So when you have something like the Colonial Pipelines, remember that a couple of years ago, right? They get in there. And so one of the things that occurred was the CEO of the Colonial Pipelines made a determination on his own to shut the gas off, because he was so concerned about how infected their networks were. He said, the only way we're going to uninfect these networks and clean them out is to shut everything down. All of a sudden, the White House gets this notification that all the gas has been shut off in the eastern part of the US. What the hell's going on? And it's well-meaning guy. I mean, he just said, hey, this is my problem. No, it's not your problem. The infrastructure affects everything else. And in doing the forensics on all that, we came to find out that none of the basic cyber hygiene, as they like to say, methodology had been employed in that company. And they, so they were behind on patching, they were behind on everything else. One of the truisms in the world of the defense industrial base today is that the vulnerabilities are more at the smaller kind of mom and pop startup level. So when the Chinese start poking around, and I saw this firsthand at Cyber Command, they can't get into the DoD networks, and the Lockheeds and Boeings are pretty resilient. And they start finding the little mom and pop shops, like they got 2 SIPRNet boxes up in, Hoboken, New Jersey. And the next thing you know, the Chinese are in there and they're pulling plans out of there for the Aegis weapon system. You wonder why the latest fighter the Chinese had looks an awful lot like an F-35. Okay? It wasn't Lockheed's networks, it was one of the subs, and that's what happened. So, and this gets back to the issue you raised a minute ago about regulation. So at what point are we going to get frustrated enough that we are going to begin to regulate, like we do in other communication networks, the way the private sector deals with it? There was a couple of years ago, there was an intrusion into the NASDAQ. It did not result in any alteration of trading. And I was at Cybercom when this happened, and this is how I know the story. What happened is there is an obscure New York State law that requires trading companies, whether the NASDAQ or the Dow Jones or the Mercantile Exchange or wherever it was, within 48 hours of an interruption of some sort in their trading, they had to notify whatever the regulatory commission. Nothing to do with cyber. It had everything to do with the stock market crash in 29, right? So they just notify them. And what happens is 2 or 3 days later, somebody says, well, wait a minute, what the heck's going on? What do you mean there's somebody in there? And so all of the visiting firemen rush to the, clean up in aisle 9 and go up to this company and try to sort through all this and figure it out. But that would never have been exposed had it not been for a law that was made without any regard to cyber, because there wasn't an onus on the company to self-report, because you are reporting on yourself when you say, hey, by the way, everything's shut down. 2 years ago, the city of Atlanta had a denial of service attack that shut down all the government for like 2.5 weeks. The irony of that is a year before that, the city of Atlanta City Council had vetoed a measure to add money to their cybersecurity program. So, here you have it. So how do you do that? And, but.
Thank you. So I have a somewhat related regulatory and industry follow-up question for you. So a lot of the work that I deal with sort of involves the intersection between chemical, the chemical industry and cybersecurity. And I was just wondering, in your assessment, to what extent is there a consensus regarding the chemical facility anti-terrorism standards program and the fact that lapsed, last summer? Broadly, it seems like the industry is very concerned about the lack of having this program enforced. And is there a cybersecurity community consensus around the significance of this program?
That's a good question. I don't know exactly in that regard, but what I can tell you is that a lot of that is state regulated. Like a lot of the electrical companies are state regulated. And so the government, US government doesn't necessarily have a role in that. The other thing I would tell you is that the National Security Agency has created what's called a Cyber Collaboration Center, which is the first unclassified building that they have. It's actually off the campus. And it is designed to bring the defense industrial base people, there's about 110 or 15 companies that are considered the DIB, to share information, to share best practices, et cetera, et cetera. But that's just because they're part of the defense industrial base. Your comment about the chemical, you could easily argue that part of the critical infrastructure is critical to the defense industrial base operating correctly. But I have not seen that direct linkage in a way that would incentivize the chemical companies to make that connection. One of the challenges they have with the Cyber Collaboration Center is that some of the companies are a little leery of jumping in with both feet because they're concerned that their intellectual property might be at risk now if they share more information, and somebody might be able to see into that, and they're working their way through all that, but it's just kind of an issue, so.
Thank you.
Thank you, General. Very interesting presentation. I have a question about the Digital Services Act of the European Community, which, as I understand it, is to prevent illegal content, protect rights of the users, data privacy, and the gateways, the US, Amazon companies, so on, don't like that. It's more regulatory and so on.
Yeah.
But to what extent does it improve cyber defense, or is there any relationship there between cyber attacks and what the Digital Service Act of the European Community is trying to achieve?
So I'm not, I don't think I'm as familiar with the Digital Services Act as you are, but what I can tell you is that we've had in the past, we, the US government, a number of years ago, had a challenge with one of the agencies that went out on their own and contracted for cloud services so that they could put information in. What they didn't realize, nor did the provider, was that some of those servers were physically located inside of the EU. And because our laws are based, for the most part, on where the server is physically located, when they went to extract some of the data out of the cloud, they couldn't get it because it was considered PII and it was under the EU rule structure. But I don't, I mean, and so there surely is an opportunity for that to have an effect on national security and on the resilience of our networks in terms of information sharing, in terms of who does what, who can access what. The piece on the law, this hasn't changed much. A number of years ago, I was in the National Security Council Deputies Committee meeting one day, and I was making the case that we should do something against this particular country with some cyber capabilities because of a whole raft of things that have been happening. And one of the people in the meeting said, well, wait a minute. And they looked, there was a map on the wall, and they said, well, wait a minute, where's that going to start from? I said, I don't know, probably Fort Meade or somewhere. They said, well, yeah, but the country's over there. That cyber effect is going to go from here to there. That means you're going to violate the sovereignty of this country in the middle. And I went, what? No, here's how the internet works. Look, there's this little guy in this server down in Miami, and he takes all these packets and he throws them around and he looks for the quickest pathway. I said, we have no idea where it's going. And I said, is a packet of information a packet? Does that mean that I violated their sovereignty? Well, the point of it was, and we got into this big furball discussion, was nobody really thought about it. What does that mean to violate someone's sovereignty in cyberspace? Or in the case that you brought up, to break a law that is designed around a physical location. We originally, initially with Cyber Command, were only allowed to conduct operations that were against things that were physically located in Iraq or Afghanistan, because that's what the authorities were. So that's what we had to deal with. So you find ways to herd people to various things, but they physically had to be there. And it was because that's what the lawyers knew, that's what they could get approval for. And so it's a subject that we're still just touching on.
Yeah, this is a really important point and great explanation. When I was commanding in Afghanistan, we had U.S. Air Force assets in Diego Garcia, controlled by the United Kingdom. And they shut down part of our operations because they disagreed with what we were doing with bombing. And we had to work all back through that, even though it was U.S. assets on U.S. targets, but because it was on a UK platform, Diego Garcia, we had to fight through those rules. So imagine the complexity that General Smittle's describing. Incredibly complex. By the way, if you're online, we'll take a question, and this side of the room has like, their score is like 10. It's like, it's like the Final Four and y'all aren't even in the competition. I mean, you didn't even show up to the game. But are there any other questions for General Smith?
Ashley, do we have anything online? No?
Thank you. General, maybe my question follows on to your point in this issues of sovereignty, but coming out of the diplomatic world, again, where we're building these strategic partnerships in the Indo-Pacific region,
Yeah.
again, countries with very different capacities and relationships to China as well. Again, we know the combatant command has its own authorities, but still there's the diplomatic aspect of it. Is everything in sync, or is there some concern that we're not as we move ahead into developing these relationships? And
Yeah.
then the very specialized one like AUKUS, for example.
Well, so that's a great example of AUKUS, right? So what we think, at least at the unclassified level, that causes the Chinese the most amount of angst is being surrounded by allies and partners. So one of the things that this administration is going out of its way to do is to try to foster the partnerships, the Philippines, Japan, Taiwan, et cetera, the Australians. Okay, so one of the ways that you deepen those relationships is you begin to share information. And the way to deepen it even more is to share more sensitive information. So the Five Eyes that I mentioned before, the US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the UK, we have had long-term relationships with them, especially with the UK. Very, very extraordinarily close partnership. And with the Australians, which is getting deeper and deeper by the day. But if you're going to branch out now and you're going to start sharing sensitive information with the Japanese, who are a great partner, but they have had their share of cyber challenges with the Chinese and their networks over the last couple of years. The Philippines, same thing. The Taiwanese, again, you've got a large number of Chinese nationals there and in the government. It's just a difficult thing. The Australians, interestingly enough, a number of years ago, passed a law that banned the use of Huawei products in national defense stuff. So as we begin to do that, but the good news is that the people that have been given that mission to figure out how to share that information technically and keep it secure are on it, and they're doing it. So I mean, I was very, very delighted to see the connection between what they were doing technically to try to keep that secure with what the big picture strategy is. So at least I don't know what's happening in the rest of the world, but in that one part that I was privy to in the Pacific, there does appear to be an effort to do that. It is very, very, it's just difficult because our view, US view of security, cybersecurity, and networks, the risk we're willing to take may be far lower. And of course, people could look at us and say, well, you're one to be concerned about our vulnerability when every couple of years you seem to have somebody that goes off the deep end and starts giving out secrets to everybody that'll buy them. So who knows? But it's a good question.
We have our last question, and it's from the virtual audience. Chris Miller. How do you evaluate the impact of the new National Security Director's Office? In particular, isn't having the impact on developing private sector or is it having the impact on developing private sector and non-military government resistance you would hope it to have?
This is the National Cybersecurity Director? This
Yes,
is what
yes.
Chris English just was? Okay.
Yes.
So, yeah, how would I evaluate that? I don't know that they have been going at it long enough to evaluate it. I do know that Chris English, who was the guy that started it and stepped down, is just an extraordinarily competent individual. He was the deputy at NSA when I was the deputy at Cyber Command. So we spent a lot of late nights together doing stuff. The purpose of that office was to try to coordinate the US government as best it could in the world of cyber. So you got CISA on one hand, you've got NSA on another hand, you've got a lot of disparate piece parts in the government, and the purpose was to try to bring it together. And what that office was really about, spent a lot of time trying to do, was to create those partnerships, that outreach, and as you try to reach out to the private sector, one of the challenges is that a lot of the folks in the private sector that have made their companies, made their fortunes, they tend to look on government regulation with a bit of a jaundiced eye. So there's always an issue about that. I mean, it's not directly cyber related, but a couple of years ago, I was doing some work with a firm in Franklin Templeton, had a venture capital portfolio, and I was working with the manager of that portfolio on some tech stuff. This after I retired, and the then vice chairman, John Hyten, was coming out to visit Silicon Valley, and he wanted to see what this Valley Magic was all about. Right, it's about 5 years ago. So the manager of this portfolio asked me if I'd come out and kind of hold his hand for a few days. One of the things that came up is we had a meeting where we brought a bunch of CEOs and entrepreneurs into the room to talk to General Hyten and brief them on what their company was doing. They're all startups, kind of exciting stuff. Some of it was really cool. And after dinner, one of these young CEOs, this guy's probably in his early 30s, he said, you know, General, this is great, and I really appreciate you coming out here. But he said, you know, first of all, he said, it's so frustrating working with the government. I don't even know how to get into it. Second of all, you're going to pick the lowest bidder, which is not going to be the capability you want. And the third thing is so far in my dealings with them, he says, you know, they don't really respect the fact that I can't work at risk. So everything he said drives you back to the big primes operating with the government. So when we start talking about this cyber office, one of the things that I know that Chris Inglis was trying to do from talking to him was to try to reach out to the broader public sector base to give them a voice in what was happening, or at least to give them some input into what was happening. But, you know, anytime you put the czar word behind somebody's name, you know that they're going to be frustrated, and they're probably going to start drinking heavily, and they're not going to last for more than a year or two. So
I know we have to close, but I must ask a final quick answer question. Where do you see the greater cyber threat? Is it from China or Russia or somewhere else?
So if you'd asked the question 5 years ago, the answer you would have gotten is the Russians. And that's because the Russians have better trade craft than anybody else. They did, right? If you ask that question today, I'm pretty confident the answer you would get is the Chinese, because what the Chinese have done in the last 3 years or 4 years is they really upped their game in terms of their trade craft. But as importantly, the Chinese do it at scale. I mean, they can throw thousands of people at a problem. And that scale is a problem. And so as their trade craft gets better, they're doing that. Of course, the Russians work through proxies all the time. So do the Iranians. And that is obviously a challenge. But the question about scale. I'm in this meeting once when I was a 1-star, and I was kind of like, it was a beauty contest, and I won, and I was the uniform that was going to be in the quadrennial defense review team, right? So that all the civilians could blame me for everything that went wrong. So we're in this meeting with Secretary Rumsfeld, and every one of those meetings with Rumsfeld was always entertaining. But in this particular day, we were having a conversation about China. And somebody was beginning to opine about what it would take to try to quell, or try to affect the Chinese militarily, and back and forth. And I mean, I was just sitting there against the wall going, you got to be kidding me. And General Pace was the chairman at the time, and he would not mind if I told you this. And he said, you know, Mr. Secretary, he said, you know what I'd do if I were the Chinese? I'd surrender 1 million men a day. We'd come to a screeching halt. We couldn't deal with that. And everybody kind of laughed. But the point that General Pace was making, which was really brilliant, is look, scale has something that we can't conceive of this. We don't understand it. So I think, and the other thing that's happened with China is, so there's now a directorate up at NSA that focuses just on China all day, 24/7, is that they have gone from being simply stealing secrets and being in the networks to getting into social media and to expanding their attempts at influence well beyond anything they've done before. So I think that's probably the answer you get in terms of that. Ben, you want to close?
Thanks. Well, we represent Arizona State University and there are more honor students in China than there are students in America. Think about that in the scale. Who's doing the work in tradecraft are learners, lifelong smart learners. Thank you so much, General Smittle, for being with us tonight. Aren't you glad that we have leaders like this on the watch in this realm that we're talking about in cybersecurity? If you're interested in seeing this again, it'll be hung on the laboratory website. That's the Laboratory for Leadership, Diplomacy, and National Security at Arizona State University. To our online audience, thanks for being with us tonight. And to all of you all, thanks for joining us. You get 0 points for audience participation.
Ben, one last thing.
Go ahead.
One last thing I need to say that everything that I've told you tonight is my opinion and my opinion only. And it doesn't reflect on any of my relationships with anyone else.
The well-trained senior leader from the Department of Defense. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.